Go ahead and start.
Thank you for waiting.
Welcome to the special board meeting. It's a study session. Roll call.
Director Carpenter,
Present.
Director Bernstein,
Present.
Director Ivinson,
Present.
Director Solana.
Present.
We'd like to note that Director Crowley is not here at the moment, but I will walk.
Okay. That brings us to the first item, public comment number 1. You can talk on anything that is not on the agenda. If there's any speaker cards, we would accept those. It just helps us keep a record of it. No public comment? All right, that brings us to the study session agenda. Item number 1, special meeting, study session regarding possible public employees' pension choices, costs, and a possible reform. No action will be taken. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Director Bernstein.
Do I need to do
It's
it?
hot all the time.
It's on.
Oh.
Yeah.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Watch what you say.
Well, I want to welcome everybody to this special study session. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Chuck Bernstein. I live in Menlo Park. I'm newly elected to the board of directors in November, and I am not new, however, to the issue of pension problems and so forth. I was involved with the pension reform group in Menlo Park, and it's a special interest of mine, but I know it's also an interest of many, if not all, of the other board members as well. So I'm looking forward to this evening's the information. Just wanted to make a very brief statement here about just social problems in general and what I hope to accomplish tonight. First of all, most of the social problems we have are man-made. Most of them have solutions, although all those solutions have costs and risks. In many of these social problems, the problem is that many powerful special interests have a stake in the problems not being solved, and that's what helps make them so intractable. And pension plans are, for better or worse, one of those kinds of problems. Couple things that I just wanted to mention as caveats for what's happening tonight. This is a study session. No decisions are going to be made. There are no decisions on the table. There are no proposals on the table. Secondly, I'm going to facilitate the meeting, but I want to make it clear I don't speak for the board. But later, when we have the open discussion, I do intend to participate. And the other point that I wanted to make is, whenever we talk about a problem, one of the things that becomes an issue is this notion of blame. Who's to blame for it? And I just want to be clear, again, speaking for myself, that I don't blame our employees for this problem. I'm not sure if there's anybody to blame for it. It's possible the problem arose without anybody creating it. But the real issue is, do we continue it or not? And I'd certainly like to invite everybody, the public, our employees, to help solve the problem. And I hope that's what our focus will be. We have 3 speakers tonight. Mayor Reed of San Jose, who I think all of you know has been active in the issue of pension problems, both in the city of San Jose and at the statewide level. And I hope that he will address the issue of pension problems in general, as well as the specifics of his experience in San Jose, because to the extent we as a special district can benefit from that experience, I think it's better to know it up front than to encounter it a second time later on down the road. We have a second speaker, and the agenda here needs to be modified again. Roy Thiele Sardinia was scheduled to speak. He was the co-chair of Menlo Park's Pension Reform Group. In his place, the treasurer, Ned Moritz, will speak about the experience in Menlo Park, any general observations on pension problems in statewide, and lastly, any, as a resident of the district, any recommendations or options he'd like to present to the board. third speaker is Doug Pryor, who is he's a vice president with Bartell and Associates. They are the district's pension consultant. He's an actuary, and we'll talk about very briefly, some of the specific problems the district will encounter. This is something that's part of a report that the district received late last summer, and he'll talk about those problems. And since he deals with other agencies, he'll talk about any other experiences or opportunities that he's seen in other agencies. I should mention one other thing about Ned Ritz, our second speaker. He is a director of a special district also. He's a director of West Bay Sanitary District. So he has to deal with these same problems in his own agency. So with that introduction, I'd like to basically turn the microphone over to Mayor Reed for his comments.
Thank you. Let's see if that's picking up well enough. Good enough? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me in to talk about pension reform, although really I think the conversation has to be broader than pension reform as you begin to try to solve the fiscal issues. Well, pension reform is a big one. It's not the only thing that you need to look at, and that's been part of the San Jose experience. So I'll talk a little bit about the San Jose experience, a little bit about the constraints on all of us in California, a little bit about our efforts on a statewide initiative, and what are the things that, based on my experience, I see that might be feasible for you to consider doing, just to put those ideas out there. Of course, I'm joined here with some people who have great expertise in the area. I worked with Matt's law firm extensively in San Jose, Myers Nave, on the issues, the legal issues. You've got good counsel there, and John Bartell and Associates have been consultants of the city of San Jose, but along with many other jurisdictions in the state. So I'm not going to try to do their jobs. They're the experts, but I can give you more of the practical flavor, the political flavor, because as mayor, that's my job. Let the lawyers and the actuaries figure out what to do, and then I've got to try to implement it. So a couple of things. First, let me pass around the one-page explanation of what's happened in San Jose. I think I got enough to get around the room, a couple extras. And part of what I think you need to do as you approach any fiscal reforms is to be able to communicate to your electorate, your constituents, your employees, your staff, the circumstances that you're in ways that they can understand. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to distill things down into relatively straightforward graphs that have proved to be very helpful as we've gone through years of debate, arguments, and some campaigns over this. So in San Jose, we had basically a decade of doing the first thing, which is cutting services to balance the budget, which is kind of the tool of first resort. We did that for a decade, and you can see that we had huge gaps. Our general fund is roughly $800 to $900 million, and you can see we had $100 million gaps in the fund. So we had a lot of distress, cut a lot of services, cut a couple of thousand jobs out of our workforce, from 7,400 down to 5,400 during this time period. Then in 2011, we adopted our fiscal reform plan. Pension reform was part of that, and we turned the corner, and then we have 7 years, 2 behind us, 1 that we're in, and a few years ahead of us where we're seeing basically flat budgets, which includes some restoration of pay for our employees and some restoration of services. Not great, but a little bit of flat is a whole lot better than the big negatives that we had before. And usually when I talk around the country, I have to give the history of what led up to us taking action in San Jose, because in 2012 we went to the ballot. Our voters approved a pension reform ballot measure with a 70% yes vote, which was quite surprising to a lot of people around the country because, well, I'm a Democrat. My council's 90% Democrat. We're a Democrat city, a heavily union city, and a Democrat state, a deep blue state, and somehow we managed to do it. So that caught a lot of people by surprise. But there's a history that leads up to that as to why we chose to go that way and what we did. And here's the 4-graph summary of the history. of what we were facing. As I mentioned, we had a decade of cutting services to balance the budget. We cut 2,000 workers out of our workforce because our costs were rising much faster than our revenues. Most people understand that if your costs are rising faster than your revenues, you're in trouble. It's just a question of how long you can hold out before you have to do some things that are drastic. So we had a decade where the costs went up dramatically, revenues only went up a little bit, and we coped with that through the traditional means, basically cutting services to balance the budget, a huge reduction in our workforce. And you can see from the slides there, I'm not sure what order you might be looking at them, but the largest single factor in those cost increases during that time period were rising retirement costs. And that graph reflects both pension as well as retiree health care, the OPEB costs. And then there's a slide that shows how this played out in our police department, which probably approximates your fire department, your fire enterprise here. Very important service, a core service. Unless the fire chief's in the room, and I don't see my fire chief here, I always say that the police is the number one service that we provide, but there's no doubt that it's an important service, and there's never any argument that public safety is a core service for cities. So even our core service areas, and there's a graph that looks a lot like this for our fire department as well, where we put a lot more money into it, but yet ended up with less firefighters and less police officers than we had the decade prior, because the costs were going up much more rapidly than we could put money into it. And so as a result, that played out across the city. Other departments fared much worse in terms of their staffing cuts. And then just to illustrate the fact that while San Jose was a surprising case to many people, we're not an outlier when it comes to these cost increases. There's a graphic on there that these are the numbers put together by the state controller based on the public documents across the state. And you can see that statewide retirement costs went up dramatically. In fact, the slope is steeper than the slope that we had in San Jose. So to the extent you're trying to deal with this problem, you are not alone. We're all facing it in varying degrees. Some places can handle it more easily than others. It all depends on how much money you have to work with. But if you're constrained on the revenue side, which most of us are, then you're back to cutting services to balance the budget. At some point, well, what's the point of trying to provide the service if you can't actually provide the service at the level that people are paying for and deserve? And so in trying to do something about our problem, we spent a lot of time looking at all the things we can do and discovered that we're greatly constrained, just like most of the other cities and jurisdictions in the state are greatly constrained by California law as to what we can or cannot do with regard to retirement benefits. So you have the California Rule of Vested Rights, which is the case law telling us what the limits are on our power to do something about pension retirement benefits, and I'm sure you can have some conversations with your lawyer about the boundaries of that. But in the real world, there is nothing that you can do that's not likely to be challenged on a vested rights doctrine, because the extreme interpretation is that on day one, when you hire an employee, you've committed yourself to a path that's going to last 75 years, and the benefits on that path can never go down, they can only go up. And you're committed. It doesn't matter what your economic circumstances are, it doesn't matter anything else. Now that, I think, is an extreme interpretation, but we won't know if I'm right or wrong about that interpretation for a couple more years. There are a series of cases working their way through the system. The San Jose case, we've been to the trial court. We won 12 out of 15 provisions, lost 3 provisions. They're all in the Court of Appeals. There's a series of other cases, Contra Costa County case, where the vested rights doctrine was used to challenge the state prohibition of spiking, which has been prohibited since 1937 when the plans were created. So even though it's been illegal since 1937, they've been doing it, and so there was a claim for a vested right to continue doing that. So you can expect that to be challenged on almost anything that you want to do, and you just have to anticipate that, prepare for that, and figure on spending some money and some time to work through it. Although in a couple of years we may have some clarity from the California Supreme Court. Also in a couple of years, November of 16, we hope to have a ballot measure on the ballot that will authorize you and every other jurisdiction in the state to deal with pension problems and retiree health care problems through negotiations, as you would normally do for pay, for example. In the next contract, benefits would be negotiable. The rate of accrual of benefits would be negotiable. People would keep what they've already earned and accrued, but you'd be able to negotiate on changes. It doesn't dictate that, doesn't tell you what the answer is, doesn't help you in that regard at all, but authorizes you and empowers you and other cities to do that. That is subject to the usual difficulties of getting something on the ballot, but we are hoping to have it on the ballot in 2016 to empower local jurisdictions to begin the process of solving their problems. In terms of what you could do today, given the constraints that you have, there are not many things on that list. Typically, if you look around the state, what's been successful is negotiating to have your employees, your current employees, pay more, or cut services, lay people off. Beyond that, it's a little more difficult to do things in a straightforward manner. I mean, those are traditional things that have been done. You're not likely to be able to even make changes for new employees with new tiers without some difficulty, because that has also been challenged around the state. But a lot of places have done new tiers. I think you have a second tier here. Los Angeles is on a 5th or 6th tier in their police department, but they still have over 20% of their general fund going into retirement costs. So the new tiers are not necessarily going to save you a lot of money, but it is something that's been fairly common around the state in terms of what you can do. That does help you in the long run, but you have to pay your bills in the short run. You have to provide services in the short run. There are potential things that you could do. It's not clear exactly what position CalPERS might take on all plan modifications. If you wanted to close your plan, just stop putting people into it, continue people with what they've earned, and accrue future differently. CalPERS will probably treat you as if you had terminated the plan, and their current policy is to figure out how much your unfunded liabilities are at a less than a 4% discount rate, which effectively would triple whatever you think your unfunded liabilities are, and then you can write them a check for that and you're off the hook. I think there may be some opportunities there. First, to challenge that on a legal basis, and two, perhaps to cut some kind of a different deal with CalPERS based on some of the things that I've been told. I don't know. I think that's worth pursuing if that is the route you wanted to go, because the safest route for any jurisdiction is to get rid of defined benefit plans and go to a defined contribution plan. It also is a pretty big step at a policy basis. We chose not to do that in San Jose. We're continuing our defined benefit plans even for our new employees because we think retirement security is important, but you have to find some way of reducing the risk, reducing the uncertainty, because defined benefit plans, you're locked in for 75 years, a very dangerous thing for governments when things don't go well. But there's important policy reasons to have defined benefit plans, and we're trying to preserve them in San Jose. But that is the safest place to be, because even if you have vested rights that are applied to defined contribution plans, you don't have the tremendous risk of the uncertainty that goes with defined benefit plans. You may have to keep paying the same amount of money, but you don't have to worry about discount rate changes. You don't have to worry about market conditions. You don't have to worry about a lot of things that are currently increasing the risk with defined benefit plans. And with that, I think I will stop talking and let the others speak. I'm happy to take questions. I've got to leave around 7 o'clock to go to Sunnyvale to another meeting. Thank you for inviting me in.
Thank you very much. I thought it might be helpful if we could just maybe ask the board if there were any specific questions that related to Mayor Reed. I forgot to mention that he does have to leave around 7 for another engagement. If there was something that was very specific to what he was talking about, or you want some clarifications or questions, I think this would be a good time to do that so that we don't lose the opportunity later. Peter?
Yeah, Mayor, I'm glad you mentioned sort of the attempt to buy out. My recollection is that at one point, a few years ago, the city council itself looked at you're on a separate plan than the rest of the
Yes,
city.
we actually have 3 plans. We have 2 independent plans, one for Federated and one for our public safety, and then we have a very small plan which the elected officials are in, and that's a CalPERS plan.
And as I recall, you looked at buying out of that.
We did. We just
And
wanted to
the
stop
results
putting.
were terrifying, as I recall.
Well, there were, let's say, out of our ability to pay category, because essentially our what we thought our unfunded liability was more than tripled when they decided how much they would charge us to stop putting people into the plan, which is, I think, an unreasonable position to put people in, because the city of San Jose is not going anywhere. This district is not going anywhere. You could keep people in that plan, continue to pay on that plan, pay off your obligations, yet have other employees go into a different plan, and there's really no more risk to CalPERS than what they have today. But their position is that if you're going to terminate your contract with them, they're treating you as a terminated plan.
Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on Peter's question, though, also. Now that we're going to have to account for the value of these plans on some sort of market rate, and that, as I understand, that market rate is going to be calculated by CalPERS themselves, won't it be very difficult for them to maintain that there's a market value of it, but they're in fact wanting to charge more than the market value of it to their clients?
Well, you would think so, but I don't think that is likely to dissuade them from doing that. I mean, it's an interesting argument, but their position is their job is to protect the plan.
Yeah. They call it the risk-free rate.
And they take no risk. If they're going to let you off the hook, then they're taking all the risk, and so they're doing it at a risk-free rate. But in reality, they don't have to let you off the hook. They could negotiate a deal that says you're still on the hook for everything you owe, and you've got to pay for 30 or 40 or 50 or 75 years, however long it is for those employees. But that's not their approach. There are people that are looking at that. There are people that are trying to come up with some sort of a financing mechanism using a municipal bond market and CalPERS together to make it possible to be able to fund that buyout cost. But right now it's not in place.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up later when we have our third speaker who might be able to address that, because it seems to me when you determine a market value, you need to take risk into account at some point. And anyway, let's come back to that.
Chuck? Yeah, I would like to hear from everyone collectively, and then at the end, I would like to pretty much summarize what everyone said and kind of add my 2 cents, if that's okay.
That's fine. I just wanted to be sure, because Mayor Reed might have to leave before everyone was done. I just wanted to be sure that we had a chance to ask any questions we had of him. So, does anybody else want to ask anything? We'll move on otherwise. Okay, our second speaker is Ned Moritz, who will talk about these Menlo Park City and Fire District resident, and has experience through the Menlo Park pension reform initiative on this matters, and deals with it as a director also.
And my story is quite different from Mayor Reed's. We're a much smaller city, more in line with your district, and we were not a city that had a serious financial issue to deal with, but with a group of people immediately, but with a group of people that understood math, basically, and saw it coming down the road, and it's still out there, and it's gotten bigger. I was the person also who filed the papers with the city clerk in February of 2010 when we started our effort that eventually became Measure L. And that also made me a target for lawsuits. As the mayor pointed out, there will be opposition, guaranteed. And the method of opposition is cookie cutter, from what I've seen, fairly cookie cutter. AFSCME, in our case, we excluded the one section, which is the police officers, but we did get sued by AFSCME and SIU, SEIU. And they sued our city plus me. So I was honored by that inclusion. The group was called the Citizens for Fair and Responsible Pension Reform. As Chuck mentioned, I will make a few comments about what we've done or tried to do at West Bay to address the same issue. Chuck, you gave us 3 questions that you wanted to have us address, and one was general pension plan problems in California and locally. The mayor has done an excellent job, so I'll just try to make a few observations from our viewpoint at that local issue. And we just saw that pensions are not about now, which really draws most of the focus in budgeting. They are about the future. So current budget conditions in most government agencies in California and most budgets don't really accurately reflect the true financial state of pension liability, and here's why. Government agencies to this date have not used the same accounting principles regarding pensions that have been used by private businesses. That's a bit ironic because the government requires certain accounting principles to be used by private business, yet they have not adopted themselves, at least under GASB. But that's about to change, and I want every one of you to please take a note of that if you haven't already been aware. In June of 2013, the Government Accounting Standards Board, known as an acronym of GASB, gave final approval to new rules requiring government agencies to handle accounting of pension funds similar to those of the private sector. This was after 3 years period of study with all sorts of input from all the parties that were involved. There is a grace period of about a year, depending upon the size of your organization, your government organization, and the larger ones were given a longer grace period. So your big pension, which we both in Menlo Park and yourself at CalPERS, they were given the longest one. So budgets that are being implemented this year don't quite fully reflect the accounting changes that GASB's called for. Next year, it's expected that these new rules will force hundreds of billions of unreported past pension expenses from hiding places into the open. And this will show in form of debt and obligations on state and local budgets throughout the country. The pension funds in California are expected to show much larger unfunded obligations than they're now displayed. I don't want to spend time boring you with the accounting intricacies, but I would refer you to a gentleman named John Dickinson, who has written extensively on the development and from the beginning of all the hearings with GASB and its impact. He's in Mendocino. They have a particularly egregious pension plan, as it were, with regard to funding. Even though it's not one of the largest pension funds, it's one of the most underwater. And I'd refer you to his website if you like. It's called yourpublicmoney.com. But the GASB new rules will only change how governments report their pension finances. They don't change how those pensions are actually funded. And that's a bit of what the mayor was talking about. It then enters into the political field. That will be the next chapter, I think, that we see once this first one is finally put to print. And I will leave it to your imagination how CalPERS and the county and city pension funds will be expected to find the funds. The assessment amounts have already been increased under the old accounting, so it's not going south. The point is the time for local agencies to act is now, and that's what we saw as citizens in Menlo Park back in 2010. And we felt it was the obligation of elected officials, and that's how we view it at West Bay, to protect their citizens as well as their employees. The second area was what was our experience with the pension changes in Menlo Park and the lessons that we had learned. First, the citizens of Menlo Park, and I dare say the whole state, understand the unsustainable math of public sector pensions. As Chuck said, nobody's to blame, really. There's probably a few people, but nobody within any of the institutions that now are faced with this problem were to blame. We devoted a portion of our campaign, however, at an effort to educate on this issue. But as one who is deeply involved in gathering the signatures in the ballot measure, I can tell you without reservation, it took little effort to explain the purpose and need for Measure L. And gathering signature was very simple. In the end, we received, as the mayor pointed out, they've got 70, we got 71% of the vote. So I think that that's an interesting number where it comes to the public understanding this. And this was, the public support is there. That's the first lesson. The second is we left our safety offers out of the initiative. At that time, we felt we were too early in 2010 to take on what is a much more politically savvy and much more deep-pocketed union than what that would give us much more difficulty in mounting, and they would mount campaigns that would cause us problems with regard to financing to come back at them. Second thing that we learned, we were wrong on this count. The citizens were well aware of salaries and pension funds, and I swear to you, the biggest question, the most often asked question was, why aren't the police involved? It was interesting in gathering these signatures. I had a very interesting 20-minute discussion with a public parks worker who was an employee of Menlo Park and came over and described the finances, the math, and pointed out that he wasn't the problem, but that the safety officers were. Third, we met with obstruction, even from city staff, led by the city manager at that time, I'd say, knowing that he had a city council with a majority opposing our effort. He repeatedly said that since our initiative would only affect new hires, which as far as we could go, as the mayor says, there are restrictions on what can be done and how fast without going through years of litigation. He deliberately ignored the obligation, I feel, that we had to look to the future and to the future for the taxpayers. As I said in the beginning, the pensions are about the future. In addition, turnover happens in every organization. And turnover is a key to what your return will be back from any change that you can make, even on just new employees. Turnover can be managed. Turnover is and should be part of every good manager's position in managing training to replace employees who feel that they either for one reason or another. And not pointing just to pensions, but people's lives change. They need to take a new job somewhere. There's a normal number that we looked at when I was in the public sector that HR people figured that there was about 25% turnover per year. That would not be unusual. In smaller organizations, of course, your numbers can escalate or be smaller than that. But 25% turnover, if that happened, even at 10% in 10 years, you've got a whole new organization under a whole new scheme. Fourth, the most important portion of Measure L is the requirement to put any future changes for pension levels or structures to a vote of the citizens. As time passes, the composition of elected boards changes, councils change, and it's easier to influence a few elected officials than an entire voting community. Fifth, your local union will fight you. They've won. They've got a good deal right now. Why should they give it up? If they wouldn't fight you, they wouldn't be doing their job. That's their job. And they will be joined by the deep funding and public relations campaigns of the statewide branches of their organizations. That's what we experienced in Menlo Park. Their campaigns will be aimed at spreading, pardon me, but fear and misinformation. And in our case, they will never fully reveal the source of the level of funding of those campaigns. They will say pensions are sacred, and once set, the California Constitution does not allow them to be changed. This is part of the cookie cutter response. This is part of what you'll hear. This is part of what you'll have to go through and get to the other side. Pensions, they'll say that pensions are a strict purview of labor negotiations. Citizens cannot vote on pensions and other compensation. And it's interesting that citizens are really expected to provide the funding, but they don't want them involved in deciding what goes with that funding. And they will base their threat of lawsuits, as they did in our case, on the state government code, saying that since only city council can negotiate compensation, in your case, being a small organization, that you'll probably come under the same code, the state government code. They'll bring up Myers-Milius-Brown Act that covers labor negotiations, and they'll talk about the Public Employee Pension Reform Act. The acronym is PEARL, and it is a large pearl for them. Ultimately, all these arguments have lost in our campaign. They went and took us to the court 2 times and lost both times on the belief by the judge that ultimately the taxpayers should have their say in the vote. Then they filed suit after it was approved by the 71%, and again lost. The massive underfunding is not their fault, agreed. It was the stock market. This is one of their arguments that you'll receive, and it's true. It wasn't their fault. And the market, but this part of it gets a little shaky. And then they'll come back and say, and the market will come back and life will be good again. I think the market, we've had enough experience right now to know that that was a very unusual market, and it's a little Pollyannish to think that it's going to be able to come back for total recovery. Just a note on experience of our practice in West Bay. We have not gone to the public. We have just dealt with our unions locally. And the one thing that we've negotiated, we have a 3-year agreement. We're in our 2nd year, starting our 2nd year right now. But we set a fixed percentage of 15% of base salary as what the district would pay. Currently, we are very blessed by a set of unusual circumstances. I don't need to take time to go into them, but we are nowhere near what we see in the city of Menlo Park or what you might be seeing here in the way of our contribution rates. But our 15% does not put a large number right now on our employees. But if the total contribution rate does escalate like we feel it will, it is on the employee then to decide whether they want to continue in CalPERS or anywhere else. If it should go to 20%, we're at 15. If it goes to 30%, we're at 15. If it goes to 50%, we're at 15. So they are able to make a logical, financial, mathematic decision on their own as to whether there's benefit or not for them. Your recommendations, this is the 3rd section for Menlo Park Fire Department to consider. Number 1, start now. This is the first step. You've got to talk about it. You've got to start putting ideas down. I think the models are there in Measure L and even in the San Jose effort. They have been challenged and approved in courts. Take the parts that work and have been approved and adapt the language to your agency. Start with applications, with the application of the changes to the new employees only, because again, turnover happens. Gather the data gathering regarding salaries and benefits, as I believe you already have in the public area, and educate the public. And if you have the power, place an initiative on the ballot and include a clause that any future changes must be made by the citizens by majority vote. And then plan the initiative to be at the next national election to ensure a large turnout. Finally, I'd like to say this is not a discussion to remove or deny pension benefits. It's about the need to correct pension levels to mathematic reality. State leaders were encouraged to make a poor decision when the stock market was at unsustainable levels, and now they are clearly unwilling to address this issue. In fact, they run from it. It's up to the local officials to protect their citizens, one district at a time. Once the hard work is done, then I wouldn't be surprised to see our state senators and representatives suddenly get interested. Thank you for your time tonight.
Let me just ask, are there any clarifying questions, anything anybody would like to ask, just to make sure they understood?
Yeah. You said that if they decide, if it goes, you give them 15%. If it goes above 15%, they can either pay that or they can opt out of the pension system?
No. Ultimately, the politics of that, which is what it really is that the group as a whole, we've got 25 employees. If the financial pain, as a practical matter, becomes too high, right now their payments are in the single digits as a percentage of pay. But if the pain should become too high, then they as a group have to decide whether they want to stay in CalPERS or not. We as the board cannot decide that. They as employees might want to vote to opt out of CalPERS.
So if they decide that they vote and want to opt out, is there anything in place that gives them another option?
We've looked at that. We don't anticipate it shortly. What we've tried to talk about is to be able to shift from a defined to a contribution plan, like a 401k. And we've been talking to employees, at least our manager, trying to explain what would happen. We've run into stone walls, quite frankly, everywhere, especially with CalPERS. They don't want to have any part of that. It would be a threat, I think, to them. But we need to educate, not employees as well as the public, that they have to understand that they're at risk as much as anybody here. If Stockton and Franklin Investments are successful in a lawsuit, the dike, the hole in the dike is just going to explode. And that's our concern about our employees. I don't think they think about that. It's not their job. They aren't financial experts or watching that. But I don't think that CalPERS is educating their beneficiaries as well as they should.
Chuck, I have a question.
Okay, I want to just make sure that what you said, that I understand what you said in that. Are you saying that the concern is that the insolvent agencies in CalPERS their obligation will need to be picked up by the solvent agencies that remain? Was that what your comment meant?
Well, I leave that to the legal experts and the actuaries, but if you look around, where else are they going to go?
Okay.
That's our fear.
I just wanted to be sure that it was clear what you meant. Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Nate, for being here. I have one question that I'm really concerned about is the financial obligations relative to CalPERS to our present employees and of course our new ones that are already retired. There has been a past asset forfeiture action against the labor union in Ohio, the truckers union, I believe. And the federal government seized their funds for pensions, and the burden was placed on the employers to come up with that pension money. And this is a concern that I have because there is no provision that I can see, unless our attorney over here can find something, that we give our employees an option if they don't want to join CalPERS and go into a 401k program, that they cannot be afforded that option if the agency, as ourselves, or your agency, right, West Bay, are members of CalPERS. They have to do CalPERS.
It's all or nothing. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So what becomes our liability as a district, as special districts, City of San Jose, if things like that happen? And I know there have been investigations and lawsuits against CalPERS. So what, maybe our attorneys can answer that for us relative to that. How are we going to handle something like that if that happens? And that's just the one question that I have, and I think it involves all of us here.
Absolutely.
If it does happen that way. Matt, do you have any?
Let me just keep it right now with Ned. Do you have an answer to his question?
I don't have an immediate answer, but that's our same fear. And it's our employees. And they go out and do good work every day, and we're proud of them. But we're both stuck with CalPERS. And until we get a political solution in Sacramento, we're all stuck with that. And so it's we as citizens, we as agencies, we as cities have to go to our representatives who run from this thing, quite frankly.
Rob, I'll bring your question back further
That's
on.
fine, Chuck.
but
I just wanted to, since
Yeah.
Mayor Reed said that he was going to leave, and I'd really like to get his comment on that. You know, do you see any daylight, Mayor, for anything like that may happen?
I'd say most of the alternatives are blocked, but there is a lot of risk. And I'm not so concerned about everybody sort of creating around CalPERS, but the bankruptcy risk is real. And whether it's pensions or retiree health care, you can look at the bankruptcy and see that the retirees have taken hits. And, you know, they're the people that are least capable because they've already retired and no longer working, but they're the ones who've taken the first hits in Stockton, San Bernardino, and Detroit. The current employees will as well. And so I think that's a problem that we all should want to try to avoid. But as a CalPERS agency, you're very constrained. San Jose was able to go to the voters because we have independent plans. We're a charter city. Our charter reserves the right of the council to change retirement benefits. So we have a little more running room than you have as a CalPERS agency.
Yeah, because I did some research on the current state of affairs with the police department, and you know, you go through the newspapers, and you know, newspapers report things. And is there, if I ask you if these things are true?
Sure.
Okay. San Jose Police Department. Yeah. That they're required now to work overtime.
Yes.
There's no option where they can't refuse to work overtime. They have to work overtime
But it's up to
because of the personnel issues there.
it's up to the chief and lieutenants and captains and how they play the field. But there is mandatory overtime, which is not unusual in the summertime. But yes.
Thank you. And that they're presently disbanding all the specialized and investigative units in order to answer calls for service?
No, that's not correct. But,
That's not correct.
But people in the specialized units, once a month, will have to go out on patrol.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
At least through the summertime, but the units still continue to operate.
Okay, great. These charts, very well done. Thank you for providing these. I'd like to know, with the training costs, I know that there were some issues relative to new academy classes that weren't filled.
Rob, I need to stop because I think we're kind of getting off topic here, if you don't mind. Does this relate to pensions somehow?
Yes, it is. It's concerning pension costs versus retention of personnel because of the training relative to recruitment, relative to those types of costs. And I see up front, in the beginning, it saves a lot of money with the retirement costs, but then when they have to compete with other agencies for personnel, then they come to San Jose and they're trained and they do their 18 months or whatever, and then they go to other agencies. I mean, I could name agencies here within San Mateo County that are reaping the good training that your city gives these police officers, and they're leaving.
Well, I think if you're trying to make the point that if you do things with pay and you do things with pensions and other benefits, that it'll have an impact on your employees, and that's clearly true. That we have a competitive marketplace, we all have to be in that marketplace, and to the extent you change things, that's a negative. Our police, we lost a lot of good police officers because
Is it true
they took
that you lost
10% pay cuts.
70% of your new academy classes within the last 2 years?
No.
That's not true.
No. But we've lost officers and we've lost recruits, and there's no doubt that it's had an impact. A 10% pay cut has a way of focusing on your career
But
aspirations.
the 70% figure is incorrect.
70% is not right. But all of our officers took a 10% pay cut, all of our firefighters took a 10% pay cut.
But
Their
the
unions
70% is not correct.
No,
As reported by the press.
that
Okay.
number's not right.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck.
Okay.
But it does have an impact on employees. You can't, you just have to deal with that and understand that and accept that. That's one of the consequences of making changes. It has an impact on your employees.
I'd like Mary just to ask one more question. Doug, please excuse me, we'll get to you in a moment. I just wanted to ask you about, your firefighters have a city-sponsored pension plan, and I wondered if any of your comments, if they're different depending on whether it's a CalPERS plan or the city-sponsored plan.
Well, I think the difference is our ability to do things. So if we wanted to change the level of benefits for our new employees, which we did, and it was part of the ballot measure, we crafted that solution as we thought was appropriate. We're not constrained by picking one of the CalPERS plans. And we don't have to go to the legislature to get permission to do something differently. And since we're a charter city, we have more ability to do things than other cities. So our ability to deal with the problem is quite a bit different than people that are locked into CalPERS. There are charter cities in California that are in CalPERS system, and they're also constrained. So it just limits your options more to be in CalPERS.
Did you have a comment here?
Well, for Ned,
Please, go ahead.
yeah, I would like to just probe a little bit on your opening comment about, no one's to blame. I think that's, we're all being very polite, et cetera. But my sense of looking at this very carefully is that, to me, it's very clear that this problem was caused by CalPERS setting unrealistic contribution rates and saying to cities and special districts and participants, oh, you don't have to worry about your contributions because we're going to make a lot of money in the marketplace. And we drank the Kool-Aid, but they made the Kool-Aid, and they handed it out to everybody without saying, oh, by the way, if we're wrong, you're the people that are at risk, we aren't. And I think as we go through this, intelligent citizens are going to say, well, wait a minute, this didn't just fall out of the heavens. This happened for specific reasons. And I know our own fire board, when we changed our retirement program for our firefighters to 3% at 50, we had absolute assurance from CalPERS, hey, not a problem. This isn't going to be any sweat at all to finance this. And we should have been smart enough to say, we don't believe you.
I don't disagree, and there was a man sitting to your left that went before our city council and said that. It was, where were we, 10 years later, and the consequences became obvious. And when I said nobody's to blame, let's just say nobody in this organization in West Bay, the workers, they're not to blame. Were there decisions made that were incorrect? Yes. And that was one of my closing areas, is that those who made those decisions either are long gone and don't give a damn, or are closeted and refusing, standing there like, the three monkeys, and not being willing to do anything about it. So that's why my recommendation is do something. Do what you can, as quickly as you can, for the benefit of the entire community that you're responsible for.
Thank you.
We all make bad mistakes, but you don't want to continue to do the same mistake over and over again.
Yeah, but you need to recognize
Oh yeah, there were
mistake.
But yeah, there's probably the ability to go back in history and collect a set of names if you want to, at the state level, at the city level, at the district level, at whatever level. But that gets you no farther than just having a set of names.
No, what it does do, though, is really puts the focus on the projections.
Oh, yes.
Because, that's where we were both misled and allowed ourselves to be misled.
Simple word, math. It's just simple math.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ned, and I know that you did.
Go.
Thank you very
Thank you
much
very
for
much.
coming.
Thank you,
everybody.
Chuck, thank you.
Did you have a question
Well, I
for
just
Ned?
wanted to thank Mayor Reed for all the work he's been doing for how many years, not multiple years, and all hard lifting. So thank you for being here and giving us the information.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any last question? Not last question, but for the sort of immediate question, just clarifying questions for Ned.
I just have one, Ned, regarding Measure L, and it's not really off topic, but it's kind of off topic, but I understand there was some kind of letter of understanding that was made between the group and the city and the unions because there was a conflict with a law. I mean, do you know what that law is?
Well, our initial effort was imperfect.
Okay,
That's the easiest way to put it. We did not include correct timing. In other words, the application, the date that the initiative was to become effective had to be synchronized with the union agreements that you had. So that if Ask Me was, so we won in 2010. And if the Ask Me union contract ran through 2011 and the SEIU went through 2012, we couldn't do anything until 2012. So that we had multiple unions involved, and that was part of the Pearl deal as well. We went through several drafts. We picked up a working draft from another group that was working on a statewide initiative, and we had to tailor it then to the application in Menlo Park. At the end, you're correct, there was an agreement that it essentially had to do with the synchronizing of the contracts with the application date. That was the biggest thing at the end. Excuse me, but the point is, we were pleased, we weren't thrilled, but we were pleased that we had won and that it was in motion and that we knew in 2 years, or within the time period, things were going to happen. And since then, the city has obviously hired new people have retired. It's moving. Things are happening. It's a much larger organization than either yours or the West Bend.
Well, Ned, your group definitely created a storm.
No, I think we just responded.
Just in an awareness.
Yeah.
I mean, to the people in Menlo Park, just an awareness.
Yeah. And again, they come out with, I want to emphasize, we feel the unions and the employees come out with a retirement program that's reasonable. And to some extent generous, relative to the public sector right now. Private sector, I'm sorry, yeah.
Michelle, can I just ask you, are people close enough to the microphones as far as you're concerned for this to be picked up? Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Doug Pryor, who's with Bartel and Associates, which is the district's consultant on pension valuations and so forth.
Thank you. Well, you know, a lot of great points have already been made here, so try to avoid being redundant, and since I'm the actuary, I'll start throwing some numbers at you to try to frame the magnitude of the issues that we're talking about here. The district really has two pension plans, one for the sworn safety, one for the non-sworn miscellaneous. If you look at the most recent CalPERS report for the sworn safety plan, the unfunded liability is a little under $41 million, and that's as of June 30, 2012. You know, Mayor Reed mentioned the kind of multiples for that liability if you withdraw from CalPERS, and he was pretty close, and he had I think a great point to focus on here is that to get out of CalPERS, their current approach to that is they want you to give them enough money that you walk away and never put another dime in, right? And I would say that with that, if that's their, you know, if that's going to be the rule for how they approach this, the liability needs to be a lot higher than $40 million because they cannot invest the money the way they're currently investing their money and not put the retirees that would eventually be paid under that plan, put their benefits under significant risk. And so they're going to take that money. They have a $40 million unfunded liability on an ongoing basis if they can invest the money sort of moderately aggressively. If they try to get money from an agency to walk away, they're going to put it in. That's where I think Mayor Reed mentioned a 4% long-term return. I think the most recent CalPERS report had a 3%. That $41 million then you know, actually goes up to $180 million, right? And so that's, you know, if there's any hope, I would say it's that, again, I would say given the current parameters CalPERS is working under, I don't think they should take $41 million from you and let you walk away, okay? Because there's too much risk. You're going to end up with retirees down the road potentially not being able to be paid their benefits, and nobody wants that, right? So hopefully, if there's, you know, any approach that might work out, it would be that you wouldn't walk away from it, but we would have an ongoing obligation, and then they could invest the money to get a higher return. It might be a possibility. I'm not saying that that's, you know, something that somebody's pushing forward is likely to happen. I'm just saying, I'm trying to explain what's the difference between that 40 million and how you get to the $180 million liability. So, you know, you've got that. You've got the GASB 68, the new accounting statement has been mentioned. You know, almost no agency in the state, or perhaps across the country, although we don't work for many agencies outside of the state, but almost no agency has a liability on their books for the pension plan right now because of the way the accounting statements work. Effective this year, the new statement is going to put that unfunded liability onto the balance sheet. The magnitude, that's the $41 million, right? So there's that out there, and you also have, yeah,
41 is the new GASB rules?
right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And, you know, that is a June 30, 12 measurement. There's a number of things that have happened since then. Actually, investment returns since then have been pretty good. I think it was around 12% for 12-13. I think through March of this year, they had a 13% return. So, you know, that'll help the number out. There are other changes, we've changed assumptions. So, you know, it's hard to say we didn't have time and it wasn't kind of under scope to update that. We could, but, you know, June 30, 12 is at $41 million. And, you know, really what's happened is, you know, CalPERS, if you go back to give you a little history, you know, if you go back 10 years ago, what agencies were telling CalPERS was, it's very difficult for us to budget. Our contributions are flying all over the place. And it was a constant criticism of CalPERS and how they're setting contribution rates. And they got to the point where they said, okay, well, we're going to put in these methodologies, smoothing methodologies to avoid that. Well, what happened was when they put those in, start having asset losses. And the smoothing meant you didn't reflect those losses to ramp up the contribution. So they got in a position, we started looking at this and realizing the liabilities aren't being paid down and they need to make a change. You have GASB, the new accounting standard, coming into play here, and that was going to make this even more front and center on financial statements. And so they have now changed those policies. Just last couple numbers for perspective, this year for the sworn safety, the contribution rate is about 30% of payroll, okay? That's in that report, most recently, CalPERS shows that ramping up to about 40% of payroll. And there are a few things that aren't in there that, you know, we update those, but we didn't do that here. It's probably by 1920, probably be 40 to 45%.
By 2020, that's
2020, right?
I'm sorry, 2020, right.
Okay, I was going to ask you what the time frame was.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, by fiscal year in 20, fiscal year 1920,
What number again?
40% of payroll.
Right, over the next 6 years.
Right.
Right.
I may have said something completely wrong there, but
No,
yeah,
no, no,
yeah. So that's, you know, agencies across the state are struggling with, you know, everyone's seen similar increases, right? The good thing, the silver lining, of course, which may be obvious, is that if you looked at these projections, if you look at projections before they put this contribution ramp up policy into place, you would see your unfunded liability was really not being paid down. You weren't making any improvement. With this policy, what you see in projections is you're going to pay the unfunded liability down. It's just going to be painful. So that's, you know, that's probably not news to anybody here about the increase in the contribution rates, but I just thought I would mention that to kind of frame the discussion here in terms of magnitude of numbers. You know, I guess another comment would be that, which I think has been touched on and just kind of reiterated, you know, under CalPERS, you know, you have to have their formula. So they will not let you say, look, we're gonna, for people hired next year, have a defined contribution plan and get rid of this defined benefit plan or do something in conjunction with it, a different defined benefit plan. You have to continue with their formula. So in terms of, you know, options for new hires, certainly limited. For options for current employees, you've got the vested right issues and everything else out there. So that is very different from San Jose's position where they are not in the CalPERS system for the most part, right? It's a huge difference in between the two entities.
I wanted to let him
Oh,
finish.
sorry.
Well, I'm the actuary, I'm not a public official, so I keep things pretty short. So that was almost all I had, really. So if you have questions, by all means.
I think so, but
Okay.
good for you.
Richard,
I mean,
go
mine's
ahead.
pretty simple. So so you're looking at a 40% rate at around over the next 6 years, right, by 2020. Is that the same rate that we've budgeted for? Is that our budget rate? 41%. So our fire district has been, I think, pretty proactive and also prepared, right, to deal with that going out to 2020 or 2021, right?
And there's a reserve because at budgeting
Right.
level,
And so I was going to ask about the reserve. I mean, 'cause we're going to have to dip into reserves. I mean, the way that it looks is that we're going to use some reserves during the higher percentages as we go through time, or go over time. But let me ask you this: how many other special districts have you seen have prepared for something like this over the next 6 years? Because I know that this fire district has done that over, I think, like over the last year to 15 months. We've budgeted for that.
last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, we just made the decision over the last year and a half.
Correct. But before that, you also paid off the 350 side fund,
Right.
which was a
2000.
liability of about $12.5 million, which then brought the rate back down for a minute to about 19%,
Yeah,
and then it went to
20%.
20.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was, I mean, that was a very smart thing to do, to pay that
Yes,
side fund down.
but
I'm
we
sure.
know that it's possible, we're prepared to deal with the 41% at some point.
Right, right.
Smart but difficult at the time
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you lose the cash, so.
Right,
And we know we're
right.
gonna have to deal with it, with dipping into reserve. But how many special districts do you see out there that are prepared for this kind of situation?
It's hard to say. I mean, not a lot, so that, you know, the short answer. You know, there are some, or even some cities, there's a Bay Area city we work with that has set up some funds and are looking at, I'm not sure to what extent they'll do this, but thinking of paying that from the liability off. So there's a number that, you know, it kind of varies a lot. We, for years, have been saying, you know, CalPERS is giving you a contribution rate, you ought to think about contributing more, but for the most part, you know, that's not something that was practical. You know, it would have been very difficult to do, and I think people kind of scratch their heads and say, well, you know, CalPERS is the same